Imagine standing at the edge of the known world. Behind you, a civilization carved from ice and iron, from saga and storm. Before you, an ocean that no map has ever honestly drawn. An ocean that swallows ships. An ocean that swallows men. An ocean that, according to every authority of the age, leads only to the void. And yet, you sail. This is not a story about Columbus. This is not the history you were taught in school. This is the story of men and women who arrived on American shores nearly 500 years before the Santa Maria ever left a Spanish harbor. People who built fires on soil that no European was supposed to know existed. People who traded, fought, loved and died in a land that the rest of the world would not officially discover for another half a millennium. This is the story of the Norse, the Vikings, and what truly happened after they found America. And what happened to them is far more haunting, far more complex, and far more human than any legend has ever dared to tell. To understand where the Norse went, you must first understand where they came from. Scandinavia, in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, was a world defined by two forces, beauty and brutality. The fjords of Norway plunged like cathedral walls into cold black water. The skies above Iceland burned with light that had no business existing. Curtains of green and violet fire draped across the heavens, as if the gods themselves were restless. And the people who lived beneath those skies were restless too. The Norse were not simply raiders, as popular imagination insists. They were farmers, merchants, poets, shipbuilders, and explorers of extraordinary skill. Their society was governed by a complex web of honor, law, and kinship. They held assemblies, the Thing, where free men could speak and disputes could be settled. They believed in a cosmos held together by a great ash tree, Yggdrasil, whose roots reached into the realm of the dead and whose branches touched the homes of gods. Their mythology was not superstition. It was a philosophical map of a violent and uncertain universe. And that universe, for many Norse families in the late 900s, was running out of room. Norway's population had grown. Land was scarce. Political consolidation under kings like Harald Fairhair meant that the old independence of local chieftains was under threat. For men who valued freedom above nearly everything else, there was only one option: sail west, sail further, find new land. Iceland had already been colonized, a volcanic, treeless, wind-swept island that the Norse somehow transformed into a functioning society within decades. Then, around 985 AD, a man named Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland for manslaughter. He did what Norse men in his situation tended to do. He found another island. He called it Greenland, famously, some say cynically, because a beautiful name might attract settlers to a place that was largely covered in ice. Remarkably, it worked. Hundreds of families followed. Two Norse colonies, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, took root on Greenland's southwestern coast. They raised cattle, built churches, and carved a civilization from permafrost. But one of Eric's sons, a sailor of singular restlessness, looked at Greenland and felt the same hunger his father had once felt in Norway. His name was Leif Erikson, and he was about to make the most consequential voyage in the history of the Western world. The account of Leif Erikson's voyage survives in two Icelandic sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. These are not myths. They are historical narratives, composed centuries after the events they describe, but rooted in an oral tradition that the Norse took very seriously. The details within them, wind patterns, coastal geography, timber availability, the behavior of local peoples, align with extraordinary precision, to the real landscape of northeastern North America. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland. He found first a land of flat stones and glaciers, Helluland, which scholars now identify as Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. Cold, bleak, silent, except for wind. He kept sailing south. Next came Markland, a forested land that researchers align with the coast of Labrador. Here there were trees, real trees. For men from treeless Greenland, this was not a minor discovery. This was wealth, raw and towering, standing in silence along a shore no European had ever named. But Leif kept sailing, and then he found it. Vinland. The sagas describe a land of wild grapes, of salmon so abundant they choked the rivers, of mild winters that shocked men accustomed to Arctic cold. They built houses there, long houses in the Norse style, and wintered and returned home with timber and a story that would echo for 1,000 years. For decades, scholars debated whether Vinland was real or legend. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein. Ingstad found something on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, that ended the debate permanently. At a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, beneath meadows and bog, they discovered the remains of 8 buildings, Norse iron nails, a Norse bronze pin, a Norse spindle whorl, evidence that women had been there too. Carbon dating placed the site precisely around 1000 AD. The Vikings had not just visited North America, they had lived there. They were not alone. The sagas call them Skrellingar, a word that scholars have translated variously as barbarians, foreigners, or simply the others. It was not a generous term, but the people it described were fully realized civilizations with their own histories stretching back thousands of years before the Norse arrived. The indigenous peoples of northeastern North America in 1000 AD were numerous, sophisticated, and deeply adapted to their environments. The Beothuk of Newfoundland, the Mi'kmaq of the Maritimes, the Inuit of the far north, these were nations with complex social structures, spiritual traditions, trade networks, and a profound understanding of the land that Norse settlers could barely imagine. The first meetings, according to the sagas, were cautious, but not immediately violent. Trade happened. The Norse had red cloth, a color that held great appeal, and dairy products. The Skrellingar had furs and knowledge. For a brief, fragile moment, 2 branches of humanity stood at the edge of each other's worlds and attempted something like exchange. But the violence came quickly. A bull belonging to the Norse settlers charged out of the forest and terrified an indigenous trading party. The resulting panic led to a skirmish. Then, more skirmishes. The sagas describe attacks and counterattacks, ambushes and retreats. A Norse woman named Freydis, Eric the Red's daughter, fierce and uncompromising, even in the most desperate circumstances, is famously described as having grabbed a sword and slapped it against her bare chest to intimidate attacking warriors. Whether strictly literal or shaped by oral tradition, the image survives because it captured something real about the intensity of those confrontations. The Norse settlers at Vinland were never numerous. Estimates suggest that the L'Anse aux Meadows settlement housed between 70 and 90 people at any given time. The indigenous populations of the surrounding regions numbered in the tens of thousands. This was not a contest that the Norse could win through persistence. After several years, perhaps 3, perhaps a few more, the Vinland settlement was abandoned, not destroyed dramatically, not wiped out in a single catastrophic battle, simply given up. The Norse packed what they could, loaded their ships, and sailed back to Greenland, leaving behind their iron nails, their hearth ash, and their spindle whirls in the Newfoundland soil. But this was not the end of the Norse relationship with North America. It was only the first chapter. What happened after the Norse left Vinland is one of history's most underexplored chapters, and one of its most fascinating. The Greenland colonies did not simply forget that North America existed. Markland, the forested coast of Labrador, appears in Norse records as a destination for timber-gathering expeditions well into the 13th century. A ship was blown off course toward Markland as late as 1347 AD, a date that sits barely 150 years before Columbus. The Norse were still going there, still harvesting wood, still navigating those waters. And there is growing archaeological and scientific evidence that the contact went much deeper than simple timber raids. Researchers studying Norse artifacts from Greenland have found objects of unmistakably indigenous North American origin embedded in archaeological layers dating from the 11th to 14th centuries. A fragment of pelt from a North American hare. Remnants of cordage made using indigenous techniques. Most strikingly, analysis of walrus ivory traded from Greenland to European markets has shown that some of it came not from Greenlandic waters, but from the eastern Canadian Arctic, the hunting grounds of the Dorset and early Thule peoples. This means the Norse were not merely brushing against Native American civilization. They were, for centuries, operating in the same environmental and economic space, trading, competing, and likely fighting over the same resources. The Thule people, ancestors of the modern Inuit, were themselves expanding eastward across the Arctic during this same period, moving from Alaska toward Greenland with astonishing speed and efficiency. They were technologically superior to the Dorset people they displaced, and in many respects, they were superior to the Norse settlers in their ability to survive Arctic conditions. The Thule hunted bowhead whales from kayaks. They built semi-subterranean houses, insulated against temperatures the Norse longhouses could not match. They wore layered seal skin clothing, engineered through thousands of years of Arctic experience. When the Thule reached Greenland, they encountered the Norse for the first time. The relationship that developed between them was complicated, volatile, and deeply consequential. For nearly 500 years, the Norse Greenland colonies endured. 5 centuries of farming at the edge of the habitable world. 5 centuries of sending walrus ivory to Europe, of building churches with imported timber, of maintaining a society that, against all geographic logic, managed to function. And then, sometime in the mid-15th century, they disappeared. The eastern settlement, the last surviving Norse colony in Greenland, simply ceased to exist before 1500. No dramatic last stand, no written record of a final catastrophe. The people were gone, and the ruins they left behind tell a story that historians and scientists are still struggling to fully read. What happened to them? The answer is almost certainly not one thing, but many. A convergence of crises that overwhelmed a society already living at the absolute margin of survival. The climate shifted first. The medieval warm period, which had made Norse Greenland marginally viable, ended. The Little Ice Age began creeping southward from the Arctic, extending sea ice, shortening growing seasons, making the North Atlantic crossing increasingly dangerous. Ships from Europe came less frequently. The trade in walrus ivory that had sustained the colonies economically was devastated when elephant ivory from newly opened African trade routes flooded European markets and made walrus tusks nearly worthless. The Norse settlers were isolated, economically ruined, climatically squeezed. Archaeological excavations of the final Norse settlements tell a heartbreaking story. The bones of cattle and sheep in the later layers become progressively smaller, the animals diminishing generation by generation as the pastures failed. By the end, the Norse were eating their dogs. By the very end, the dogs were eating them. A letter written in 1448 by Pope Nicholas V, one of the last European documents to reference the Greenland Norse, describes a colony that had been ravaged by a barbarous fleet from the neighboring coasts of the heathens. Whether this refers to Inuit raids, European pirates, or some combination of both remains unclear. What is clear is that by the time the outside world thought to look, the Norse Greenlanders were gone. Genetics tells us the most unsettling part. Some of them, it seems, did not simply die. Recent genomic research has produced findings that reframe everything. Studies of Inuit populations in Greenland have found traces of European, specifically Norse, genetic ancestry embedded in lineages dating back to the period of Norse-Inuit contact. Some Norse individuals, it appears, did not return to Europe and did not die in their collapsing settlements. They joined the Inuit. This was not a romantic exchange in the way that legends might construct it. It was almost certainly the product of desperation, survival, and the brutal arithmetic of catastrophe. A Norse woman, her community dissolving, her children hungry, her longhouse crumbling. Perhaps she made a choice that no saga ever recorded. She walked toward the smoke of an Inuit camp. She stayed. There are also tantalizing, if not yet conclusive, genetic traces of possible Norse ancestry among certain indigenous populations of northeastern North America, suggesting that some Norse individuals, or their Greenlandic descendants, may have traveled, traded, or integrated further south. And then there are the artifacts. Indigenous oral traditions from Arctic communities carry references to strange people with pale faces and unfamiliar boats who arrived long ago from the east. Objects of Norse origin have been found at indigenous archaeological sites far removed from any Norse settlement. A piece of chainmail, a bronze balance weight used for measuring silver. These objects traveled along trade networks, as gifts, as trophies, as curiosities, deep into North American indigenous networks, moving from hand to hand through a continent that the rest of the world believed was unknown. The Norse did not simply explore America and vanish. They left material, genetic, and cultural traces in the fabric of indigenous life that persisted long after the last Norse longhouse crumbled into the permafrost. America didn't merely receive the Vikings. In a very quiet, very human way, America absorbed them. The question that haunts this entire story is not simply what happened to the Vikings. It is, why did Europe forget? The Norse voyages to North America were known, in fragmented form, to Scandinavian communities throughout the medieval period. The sagas were copied and preserved. The memory of Vinland survived in Icelandic scholarship. Yet this knowledge did not penetrate the broader European consciousness in any meaningful way. When Columbus sailed in 1492, he was acting in complete ignorance of the Norse experience. Not because that experience was secret, but because the Norse world and the Mediterranean Atlantic world that sponsored Columbus occupied different information ecosystems. There is something deeply human in that failure of transmission. Knowledge, without the structures to amplify and preserve it, dies quietly. The Norse told their story in sagas that only Iceland could read. Columbus told his story to monarchs who controlled the most powerful communication networks in the Western world. The outcome was not determined by who arrived first. It was determined by who could make the world believe they had arrived. But today, 5 centuries after Columbus, 1,000 years after Leif Erikson, The full picture is finally coming into focus. The Norse story matters not because it diminishes Columbus, but because it expands our understanding of human curiosity, human courage, and human connection. It reminds us that the history of exploration is not a single heroic narrative flowing in one direction. It is a vast, tangled web of voyages, contacts, exchanges, and encounters, most of them unrecorded, most of them forgotten, most of them irreducibly human. Long before the age of empires, long before the era of conquest, a Norse sailor named Leif Erikson stood on an American shore and listened to the silence of a continent that had no name for him. He built a fire. He looked at the trees. He stayed one winter, maybe two. And then he went home, carrying timber, carrying stories, carrying the memory of a world that the rest of humanity would have to rediscover on its own. History rarely ends. It dissolves. The last Norse man in Greenland didn't know he was the last. He woke one morning in a world that had grown too cold and too silent and too empty, and he made whatever choice the morning demanded of him. Perhaps he walked toward the sea. Perhaps he walked toward the smoke of someone else's fire. Perhaps he simply sat in the ruins of his hall and waited for a ship that never came. We do not know his name. We do not know his face. We know only that he was there, at the edge of the world, at the end of his civilization, and that the land around him was ancient and vast and utterly indifferent to his survival. The Norse came to America 1,000 years ago, and for a brief, extraordinary moment, two branches of the human family stood face to face at the margin of the known world. They traded, they fought, they feared each other, they may have loved each other. And then the ocean, the ice, and the slow grinding weight of history pulled them apart. But something of that meeting survived. In the soil at Lanceau Meadows, a Norse woman's spindle still rests where she dropped it, or where she left it, 1,000 years ago. In the genomes of Inuit communities, a trace of Norse ancestry persists, quiet and molecular, as if a person from another world chose to become part of this one. In the oral traditions of Arctic peoples, the memory of strange, pale-faced visitors floats at the edge of story, neither fully remembered nor fully forgotten. The Vikings came to America. They found a world that did not need them, that could not hold them, that ultimately overwhelmed them. And when they were gone, when the last longhouse fell and the last fire went cold, America continued, as it always had, turning slowly beneath a sky that had witnessed everything and recorded nothing. Their story didn't end in triumph. It didn't end in conquest. It ended in the most human way possible. It ended in silence. And in that silence, if you listen carefully enough, you can still hear the wind off the North Atlantic. You can still hear the creak of a Norse ship running before the gale. You can still hear Leif Erikson's voice, steady and certain, calling back to his crew as a green shore rises from the western horizon. Land, he says. Land.